brilliant information she has to share. Isolde Brielmaier is the newly appointed Deputy Director of the new museum in New York City, as well as Curator at Large at the International Center for Photography in New York. Previously, Isolde served for 6 years as Executive Director and Curator of Arts, Culture, and Community at Westfield World Trade Center, a role in which she developed artist projects and installations, cultural events, and strategic and community partnerships across the organization. Isolde is also Professor of Critical Studies in Tish's Department of Photography, Imaging, and Emerging Media at New York University. She serves as editor-at-large at Airmail, Graydon Carter's new media venture, along with several other art journals, and speaks regularly on topics related to art, culture, and social impact. In addition to the prestigious activities already mentioned, Isolde has worked for the Guggenheim Museum, the Bronx Museum of Art, and as Chief Curator for the SCAD Museum of Art. She's deeply committed to the promotion of social justice and human rights, specifically global women's issues and criminal justice reform. Isolde holds a PhD from Columbia University. Throughout her curatorial career, Isolde has collaborated with noted contemporary artists, including Carrie Mae Weems, Ellen Gallagher, Leonardo Drew, Richard Moss, Ivan Navarro, Wangechi Mutu, Bill Viola, Hugo MacLeod, Fred Wilson, Tyler Mitchell, and Barty Kerr, to name a few. She's written extensively on contemporary art and culture, with her most recent book, Culture as Catalyst, being released last fall, 2020, and her forthcoming photography book, I Am Sparkling, which we'll hear some about tonight, will be released in this coming spring, 2022. So Isolde, very excited to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Hannah, and thank you, Evan, for having me. It's a delight to be here. I have to shout out to one of my new museum colleagues, Scott Campbell, who I simply respect and adore, who took his time after a very busy day. Scott, I feel like I just saw you in the museum, so thank you for being here. And welcome to all of you. Thank you for tuning in on a Thursday evening. I'm really excited to be here. So I'm going to jump in because for me, the most interesting part of these talks are always the exchange that you have with the audience and the Q&A. So I won't read a mile a minute, but I'll go through my talk at a nice clip so that we have some time at the end to really have a meaningful exchange. For those of you that know me and know my work, and thank you, Hannah, for that introduction, I pretty much am situated within the contemporary art space. I have a specialty. My PhD was in photography at Columbia, but my curatorial practice spans all media, but it's always geared towards the contemporary and working with living artists. So this is going to be a bit of a pivot, and this harkens back to my days as a graduate student. I won't give you years because none of you need to know that. But this was sparked by some family history, but I like to tie it very much to the present day, as I think you'll see, because I think when we talk about photography, and especially for portrait photography, it's not only grounded in the historical, but highly relevant to everything that is around us today in terms of voice, agency, representation, and storytelling. So I'm going to share my screen. Give me one moment. Hopefully there we go. Okay. And can everybody see that? Okay, great. Let's start from the. So during my very first family trip to Uganda at the age of 6, I came across this photograph of my grandparents that you see on the screen. And this was a photograph that was taken in the 1940s in one of the oldest photography studios in Jinja, Uganda, where my father's family is from. And this is a photograph of my grandparents on their wedding day. And I remember staring at this picture for a really long time, really enamored by their elegance. I think in this picture, my grandparents to me had a very quiet presence, but still so regal, dignified, and so confidently poised in front of the camera. You can see my grandmother wears an elegant white dress and a beaded crown on her head. And next to her stands my grandfather in a crisp tailored suit. And I remember very clearly as I was looking at this image, wondering why I'd never seen such an image of Africa or Africans back home here in the US. And I wondered to myself at that very young age, why was it that the images of Africa that I saw all around me in the US differed from those that I saw at home and with my family? And why did those images that were circulating around me not reflect this type of beauty and everyday moment that I knew my family, along with myself, had experienced regularly while we were in Uganda? And little could I have ever imagined that that moment of viewing this image of my grandparents would serve as a springboard for my deep interest in and work on visual culture, representation, subjectivity, and storytelling as both an undergraduate and graduate student at Columbia here in New York City, where I'm situated. And it would also become the impetus for much of my past and current curatorial and socio-political interests, from artists and exhibitions to today's world of social media and the constructed selfie, as well as my PhD dissertation, which was at the time one of the very first to take on contemporary portrait photography along the Indian Ocean coast as its subject. So years later, after my grandparents had passed away, I found myself returning to and reflecting upon this very same photograph and the story of the two people revealed within its frame. And these more recent reflections, I think, for me, in turn, reignited an interest in returning to my earlier work in search of people and voices and pictures in order to connect some of the dots that I had discovered back then, and perhaps even to create a few new ones. So I started as sort of a backdrop, my work along the Indian Ocean coast in the summer of 1999 by taking short breaks from my family visits inland to both Uganda and Kenya, and traveling to the coastal cities of Mombasa, of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, of Lamu, and of Zanzibar to look at the photographic history of each place. And I spoke while on these visits to scholars and students and museum teams and antique dealers and store owners, and most importantly, everyday folks simply sitting on their porches or in the center of town. And I would inquire with them about what each of them knew or had seen with regards to photography or photographs in each place. I returned not too long after that to spend about a year and a half in Mombasa, Kenya. And Mombasa is Kenya's largest port city. It's sort of the largest port city on the eastern coast of the African continent. And that was in 2000. And it was really during this time that I came to know the visual history of the city, of the surrounding islands, Lamu and Zanzibar in particular. And I developed a number of really, really good friends. And I sort of developed a regular routine of visiting people in their homes and sipping chai tea and sharing our histories and our lives and our stories. And I actually brought a lot of my own photographs with me to kind of, sort of bolster the visual aspect of those exchanges. And as I sat with people, these friends, new and old, each of them kind of fondly took me through decade-old collections of photographs. They brought out boxes and frames of images, single snapshots piled in neat stacks, or elaborate kind of albums embellished with descriptions and decorations. I was really enthralled by this process. And I was taken with both their pride and sort of serving as my guide through all of their histories, as well as with the portraits themselves. Each one seemed formal. They were deliberate, they were composed, and really kind of conveyed a state of contentment of the sitter. So it was really kind of an incredible experience. The psychological, and this is sort of the word that I'm pulling from the title, this psychological concept of flow, really came to mind to me since that time, and particularly now that I recall these exchanges. And this notion of flow was coined by a psychologist by the name of Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who describes it as a state of optimal experience in which a person performing an activity fully immersed in a feeling of energized focus, full involvement, and enjoyment in this process. This is sort of what this psychologist describes as flow. And so for me, in essence, flow really is characterized by the complete absorption in what one does, and it sort of results in the loss of one's sense of space and time. And I'm hoping that we all here today have experienced that moment of flow, but it's just a really nice kind of phrase that conjures up a range of feelings. And for me, it seems to describe both the photographer and the client perfectly. Not only as I looked through some of these old photographs were the photographer and the client in the act of making the photographs that we beheld, but long after that, the subjects, the clients reminisced with all of these haptic objects in their hands, and really just sort of got into this flow of kind of telling stories. People described and displayed an experience that really didn't seem ordinary, but definitely memorable, a significant moment that cultivates in a sort of a purpose, or sort of in otherwise sort of makes meaning for a person at that particular moment in their life. And it seemed that each person I sat with was fairly exuding in both purpose and meaning when they described their photographs. And these experiences referenced something that had taken place decades ago, but that really didn't matter, because in our back and forth exchanges, neither of us could sort of get enough of the kind of vicarious happiness and sort of joy and laughter that all of these discussions about photographs brought forth. So this is a picture of Mombasa, a sort of classic picture of Mombasa. And as I think through the social history of photography along the Indian Ocean coast, and specifically in Mombasa, Kenya, one of my primary aims was to really bring to the fore the centrality and history of interstitial spaces in the articulation of culture and identity more broadly. And this is a point that really seems so salient now more than ever. My intention in this work was not really to reinscribe the practice of photography along the coast within the colonial history or trajectory of a more sort of traditional historical discussion on photography in Africa. And we've all heard those discussions of colonial images and sort of the rise of photography as it moves hand in hand with anthropology. But for me, first and foremost, my aim was to assert that, like people's engagement with many significant cultural practices around the world, the photography studio in Mombasa was in fact a liminal space that was in a way free from the confines of, quote, official culture. And one of the references here for me is Mikhail Bakhtin, the writer, where he writes on the notion of the medieval carnival, which is a literary mode that kind of subverts and liberates the assumptions of dominant style or officialdom through humor and chaos. And so in a way, similarly for so many of the clients of these photographers, and I'm going to talk specifically about one photographer, the studio becomes this space in which to freely explore, express, play, and challenge ideas of what one is supposed to be and do, and what one could be and do. My second aim or hope was to highlight how the studio space and the creative activities that occurred within it allowed for a focused and positive growth or blossoming on the part of the individual studio goer, who together with the photographers had the freedom to draw from visual and material culture around the city of Mombasa in ways that were really important to local identity, construction, and assertion. And, again, when I think about the idea of flow, it's not only the flow that one has with the photographer, where you kind of get into this mode of back and forth and posing and really sort of creating this world, but it's intended to be kind of legible across multiple spheres. So it refers to this sort of playful flow. It refers to this imaginative flow that was essential to the ways in which people self-fashion and came to see themselves, as well as to the exchange and flow of goods and ideas, many of which sort of find their way into these photographs, and also maintain a very significant kind of place within both the history and the trade and the current life of the Indian Ocean region. So here you're looking at an example of an image. This is from NV Parekh studio. This was the primary photographer who's no longer with us in the studio that I worked with, in part because he was the one that everybody referred to as sort of being the star photographer. He also happened to have quite a few dozens and dozens of images sort of in boxes that I spent probably about a year and a half kind of creating an archive. You're looking at an image taken in 1959. This is Ms. Kassam in sunglasses from the Parekh studio. Within all of this, the critical and still overlooked role of an engagement by women in the photographic practice, I think I would argue throughout Africa, and again, we're thinking historically here, and the diaspora more generally, and of course, in this case, along the Indian Ocean coast, really sets the stage for a broader discussion of the ways in which women use photography as a transformative gesture that turned the studio into a self-constructed and creative venue for exploration and expression. And this really, I think, in so many ways offered a critical means of self-determination, empowerment, and the opportunity to occupy the spotlight for many women, particularly women who had the means, right? Because going to the photo studio may have been to a degree deemed a necessity, say if you were showing up at the photo studio to document the end of Eid, right, the Muslim holiday, but it also was an act of leisure. And this opportunity really was a chance, as many women, and one in particular whom you'll hear from, to sparkle on one's own terms. In this context, then, through the client's intense focus on fashioning and asserting themselves, the photo studio becomes this literal and conceptual tool of both visibility and mobility, a social mechanism by which many women were able to construct visions not only of their aspirational selves, but also traverse and sometimes challenge boundaries through modes of dress, whether it's pants, whether it's removing one's veil, whether it's wearing a different pattern or style of clothing. Also through gesture, pose, use of props, and self-presentation that really comes to frame their everyday life. So here's three women from the 1960s, also in Parekh studio. And one of the things about his images, particularly from the 50s and 60s, is this sort of classical kind of almost becomes this sort of signature symbol, this classical pole or column that you see on the right. Here you're looking at Ms. Kurju with pole from Parekh studio, 1957. So 50 years after East Africa's first studio was established and began producing postcards in Zanzibar in 1868, photographers of South Asian descent began tailoring their services to diverse studio customers. And in Mombasa, Kenya, these customers were urban Swahili, Asian African, and newly urban African clients, and they used portrait photography from roughly, Parekh studio was really thriving from about the 1940s through the early 1980s as an important practice, as I mentioned, to envision, negotiate, and produce new multi-layered urban subjectivities. Coincidentally, beginning in the 1950s, many women became more publicly active, joining various social organizations, improvement associations, with some also taking jobs and openly expressing interest in broader social and cultural aspects, as well as popular culture, such as film and music, along with urban fashion and beauty. And some might say that they began to negotiate and define the very meaning of modern womanhood within the city of Mombasa. Accordingly, there's a scholar that worked very early on in Mombasa, in particular within the Muslim communities, Margaret Strobel, who suggested by the 1960s, women from a range of backgrounds, and this is actually not only just in Mombasa, but also in the capital, Nairobi, had already began working in the health and education fields specifically, and soon entered the administrative workforce. And while only a small percentage of all women worked, the women who held jobs appear to have been active consumers. And this is where photography really comes into play. And the market, I think, very much responded. So through a lot of the early research and spending time in the archives in Mombasa and in Nairobi, I was able to sort of dig up advertisements for makeup and wigs, skin lightening creams, clothing that was imported, various styles. And although not all women worked or consumed these items, the portraits produced in Mombasa, and specifically in the Parekh studio during this period, really suggest that such articles were popular among those who had the finances or the means. And here's an example, as you see here in image number 4, which features a young woman in a tailored mini dress. I don't know about anybody here in the audience, but I recall images of my mother in these very kind of similar mini dresses, and I'm sure they've come back 1,000 times already, as well as a wig holding a large purse that matches her her fashionable high-heeled shoes. So women who had the means to do so visited these photo studios for a variety of reasons. Some went for practical and traditional purposes, such as obtaining a photo for identification cards or creating a portrait to send as part of a marriage proposal. Yet there were many other women who saw the studio as a necessary pause, I think, from daily life, a place to dream, imagine, and situate oneself in an entirely different world. And this really offered a chance to kind of walk away with an enhanced sense of oneself and a concrete articulation of sort of an envisioned and perhaps later for some realized mobility. These completed portraits were often shared and discussed among friends and family, and often opened up broader conversations about one's life and ideas, hopes and dreams. And I spent a lot of time with women, particularly young women at the time, talking about photographs and then sort of allowing those conversations to take us on various themes. And those conversations would take place in the home, they would take place in the beauty salon. There was one gym that a lot of women went to, if you can believe it. So we all would go there, and inevitably we would have conversations. One of the more remarkable images from this period is this image of Miss Marima John, also from the Parekh studio from the mid-1960s. And it features a young woman reclining horizontally on a small platform. It was taken in the mid-60s. And one of the reasons I say it's remarkable is because one of the things that I did after I peeled some of the sticky images that I found in boxes in Parekh studio up in the attic, and then, or sort of salvage the negatives, I would make copies of them. And as I moved around to talk with people, I would show them some of the images and sort of just get their take. Sometimes people actually recognize people. And so that allowed me to kind of track people down. That was an element that was very important to me, because at that point in time, we had looked at a lot of African photography here in the US and Europe, right? We didn't discover it because obviously people in Africa knew it existed, but we were doing a lot of talking for the subjects. And I was really interested in who was pictured and what they and those in their community might have to say about those images. So what struck me about this image is I actually shared it with 2 young Swahili women who I grew very close with, and we would hang out fairly regularly. And they reviewed this photograph while the 3 of us were at the hair salon one afternoon. And they interpreted what I call the, quote, sort of language of the image. And they made several observations, I think, that in many ways probably would have been lost on me. And they said, quote, "We don't know who she is or what she's doing, but she is without a doubt very stylish. Maybe she's someone famous, and she definitely lives in the city. She has money, or maybe she's married to someone with money. Look at her nails. They are long and nicely shaped, and her henna, the faint tattoo-like markings on her arms. She's definitely Swahili. The fabric of her dress is like kitenge fabric, which is a common printed cloth. And she had that outfit made by somebody very good, probably an expert tailor. She has created her own fantasy world in this picture. She's also very thin, and she's wearing a wig. Those were very expensive. We knew someone who is now a bit older who had a wig like that, and it cost a lot of money. She seems very confident. And look at her feet. They are clean and shaped, so it is clear she never walks barefoot. without shoes. I just thought that was just really wonderful, right? That they are sort of reading the language, kind of through their own lens of this image. And the comments are really helpful in elucidating thoughts around gender, around ethnicity, class, notions of beauty. And I think they also highlight many of the larger issues noted earlier, the importance of the freedom to dream within the studio space, the intense focus on the part of women as they ideate and reconceive of themselves and envision realities both to attain or perhaps to aspire to. And finally, these observations, I think, highlight agency and the sort of empowering aspects of the photographic practice for many of the women who claimed their visible space, as you see here in the spotlight. In this context, and based on discussions with many women, both strangers, friends, and even family when I went back inland to see my family, I was really interested in this positioning oneself in the spotlight, this act of positioning oneself, of occupying and taking ownership, pardon me, of the studio floor in front of the camera. And for some reason, this also drew a relationship to a wonderful scholar by the name of Krista Thompson, who studied a lot of photography and photographic practices in the Caribbean. She makes this astute assertion that a focus on light's effect and shine in both popular photographic practices and contemporary art, specifically as they relate to the African diaspora and Jamaica in particular, has now informed new approaches to visuality and to conceptions of value and types of image making focused on the skin as a photographic medium. And while Thompson's emphasis on skin as a medium may not fully resonate here within the Indian Ocean context, I think her notion of using light and using the body as a way to create prominence and visibility is really central to many women's experiences in the studio and to their ability to establish their physical presence and stand out in critical ways, as you see in this image through the use of pose and clothing and accessories and expression and gesture in front of the lens. This is one of my favorite images and also one of my favorite people. This is Mrs. Uweso. We call her Mama Uweso. And this was taken in the early 1960s at Parekh Studio. And she and her husband had many, many photographs. And we spent a lot of time together in that year and a half. And we reviewing and looking at all of these photographs. And it so happened that she also had a really nice collection of photographs that are really, I would almost call them, as she did, glamour shots, pictures that she could put on her wall or give to her husband and family. And she favored, these images, she favored at once the realism as well as the creativity and imagination that were sort of evident in these images. And what you're looking at is one of her favorite images, which was taken by Parekh when she was 8 months pregnant. And this is her commenting on the image. I really like to see what I look like at different stages in my life. And these types of photos gave me the opportunity to do so. They made me think about who I was and sometimes who I wanted to be. They could remind me that what I wanted to do in my lifetime. That is what photography is for. Keeping track of yourself, your thoughts, and all the different things that happen in your life. And at the same time in the studio, I could dream. Look at the light, look at the glow. It looks as if I was floating in another world. I am sparkling, and the focus is simply on me. And I think, this, again, really beautiful, and it's so powerful, I think, to hear the words of the person that you're looking at. But as Mama Uweso so poignantly expresses, and I think this is really the dual aim of my work, it's the physical space of the studio, as well as the space that was allowed for and sort of inspired the things that really brings us back to this idea of sparkle and maybe even of flow. The studio Mombasa offers this place to believe in the reality of a shifted sense of self. I think in so many ways, it really allowed people to manifest their dreams, as Mama Uweso notes, and really think about, or at least play with, who they wanted to be. It's a physical space where things could really happen. and they could happen on it's sort of on an emotional and spiritual level. And in a way, I think, as Mama Uweso alludes to, really set the stage for transformation even. Thank you.
Isolde, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation and sharing those images that are obviously significant to your research, but I also, definitely walked away with a sense of the power that they hold for those individuals and their personal stories as well.
Thank you for letting me riff and discuss these images.
We have a question, Isolde, in chat from Peter Mustardo.
Great.
From Peter Mustardo, who would you ask Isolde to speak on the differing nature of and response to the physical or haptic nature of an analog photo print versus a digitized image? And if I can layer on to Peter's question, maybe perhaps specifically in this African studio context that you're exploring.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's sort of an interesting discussion, right? Because the kinds of photographs that we're looking at are no longer, generated. We're in the age of the constructed selfie, of the digital image, of the moving image. And as my students at NYU like to say, there's been a huge shift away from, quote, straight photography. The thing about these images is that not only were they images, but they were objects, and they were objects to be held, they were tactile, they were objects to be exchanged, to be shared. So it wasn't even just about, it extended far beyond the visual, right? And moved into this, they became kind of these sort of physical, it's like physical currency. In a way, I think that digital images are not, but there's still currency around digital images, right? If we think about social media, we think about the modes of exchange for digital images, probably far more wide-reaching than the images that I've just discussed. I will say that the photo studios in Mombasa, and this is probably similarly true of the history of photography in West Africa and even Southern Africa, they really kind of began to disappear around the 80s with the rise of the Brownie. I think everybody here remembers probably or knows of the kind of Kodak Brownie, or those little pocket cameras, where you could really circulate little cameras yourself, take pictures, whether you were in the city and you had your own camera, or like my family, you lived, my father's family, in the rural areas, and there were a few people in your town or village that had cameras. So you would go and pay a few shillings, have your image taken, and then when the whole roll was done, whoever had that camera would drive it into the city and get it developed and then bring the images back. So yeah, I mean, it's and now digital, right? So cell phones and smartphones are fairly present. And if people themselves can afford, they know people that have them and are able to kind of, have images or pay to have images taken. There are internet cafes everywhere, even in some of the more rural areas. So, and it's actually been very life-changing, to be honest with you. It's just, cell phones have changed the modes and ways that you can communicate. So I can just pick up the phone and call my family, as opposed to having to make a time for them to go to a rotary phone and, you have a phone date. But that has definitely impacted the kind of production and circulation of images as well, which tend to be then kind of floating in this more sort of virtual space.
Barbara Tannenbaum, our friend Barbara Tannenbaum, asks about your notion of women who claimed their visual space in the portraits you showed is such a lovely and positive notion, she says. Is the studio the specific place where people would go for formal portraits that allowed women to claim the space? It's like a moment of, it moved on me. I'm sorry. I started reading two different comments here. Let me get back to
I think that was part of it. I mean, it's this notion of the studio. I mean, look, did the photo studio, was that tied directly to women's quote liberation? I mean, that's probably not for me to sort of assert or claim. I would leave that up to the many women pictured and the many women with whom I spoke. But I think Parekh in particular was very aware of his clientele and who they were. He would, he was highly popular after Eid, which is the big celebration after Ramadan, and he would actually have extra hours. He would stay open much later as people, began to celebrate Eid. So my reason for bringing that up is that he very much catered to his different clientele. And so when it came to women, sometimes his wife at the time would come in and assist a little. And I think that also helped to kind of put people at ease. If you were talking about, Muslim women who came into the studio, oftentimes they may have been accompanied by a male relative or a husband, but sometimes they came in groups or in friends. And there was a comfort level that in some way allowed them to unveil for that moment and have that photograph taken. Was it a moment of Zen? I'm not sure, but it was a moment where they could step in a way outside of themselves and perform or experiment with something that they kind of like to see or had been thinking about. So there was an element, and again, I don't want to overemphasize that. I think it varied for different women and women of different communities, but there was a moment of kind of a sense, a bit of freedom, and you see that in some of the images themselves.
Apologies to both Linda Benedict-Jones and Barbara. I have mangled your two questions. I ascribed Linda's comment to Barbara, but Barbara's actual question was, did the photographers offer types of poses and setups? How much agency did the sitters have in choosing how their picture would be taken? It seems in the last photo you showed that it follows the movie star headshot formula and lighting, pose, camera angle, etc. She asks, how much were the sitters deciding how things would be presented? Yeah,
that's a great question, Barbara. So, and I like that you put agency in quotes, because agency always, it needs to be in quotes, right? Depending, really depends on, my sense of my agency may be very different than your sense of my agency and then your sense of your own agency. So the one thing I will say, and I talked a little bit about this, Barbara, was this idea that there were so many goods flowing in and out of the city. And I will tell you, one of the things, I had a lot of time on my hands while I was there, Barbara. So if I wasn't researching, I was sort of like, oh my God, these are the longest days. How am I going to fill my time? So I would go to the movies. Bollywood was huge at the time and still is. I don't know if many of you know, but Africa, and specifically Eastern Africa and Nigeria, are two of the largest consumers of Bollywood, right? And Nigeria, of course, has their own film industry, Nollywood, which actually I think outnumbers Hollywood at this point. But the reason I bring that up is that people were exposed and engaged with a whole kind of range and flow of goods and images and sort of cultural references. And so to your point, movies were really big. Magazines were really big. So sometimes people would bring images in of pictures and say, I want to look like this, or this is how I want to pose. But one of the, and again, you talk to Parekh and he'll say, well, no, it was me. I have a very special photographer's eye. So I would always kind of position people and do this. I have the distinct feeling in talking to everybody that it was a little bit of both, right? So that we know that these, and this is probably true across the continent, because I definitely have some knowledge of portrait photography in the West and in the South, that it came out of a little bit of a collaborative exchange, right? Of like, you situate here, okay, no, I want to situate here, or I want to look like this. It was a little bit of both, but I think for Mrs. Uweso, for example, perfect observation, Barbara. It's a glamour shot, but she's very strongly spoken. So she was very kind of clear on how she wanted to appear. And, as she would tell me, she would take these images and she was really in a way building a collection, which I think is really funny. And she was not shy about it. So I think it's a little bit of both. And I think that being a little maybe kind of fluid in our thinking around agency and what that means for people, I think then allows for, sometimes the photographer weighs in, sometimes the subject or client, and sometimes it's a little bit emerges out of a little bit more of a back and forth.
I was really struck, Isolde, by your commentary about the woman in the paisley dress.
Oh, yeah.
For a couple of reasons. One, as you said, that the people that you showed it to had such a kind of visual literacy about it that they were able to unpack this photograph in such a detailed way. But at the same time, as you were talking about it, I thought, so many conversations about, people saying, oh, well, he looks Italian, or he looks Jewish, or he looks something. They're sometimes right and they're sometimes wrong, right?
Right.
And so I wondered, when you spoke with people about their ideas about how someone had presented themselves, whether you found that it was as often misleading as it was illustrative.
That's interesting. I mean, for me, I think I actually do believe she is Swahili. I think the henna and the appearance, if you kind of have a sense of the social fabric of Mombasa. But I think more than that, Evan, I think for me, it was less about the kind of right and wrong, and more a little bit about the nuances, like the way in which they read, like that's a wig, it was super expensive. The one piece wasn't in there is they talked about her feet and her nails, and they said, well, clearly she doesn't work with her hands. I thought that was amazing. My jaw dropped. I never would have noticed. I mean, I get a pedicure every now and then, I walk on the beach barefoot, but like I never sort of look at my feet and then extrapolate from that elements of class, right? And sort of my status, right? And so those were the things that were, that I wouldn't have been able. I'm not from any Mombasa community. I've spent a lot of time in East Africa, obviously, but I wouldn't have looked at it through that lens. And so I found that fascinating. Now, human beings are human beings, right? So we like to categorize. We like to kind of say, oh, well, she's, of that kind of, community, or she's like, she does that kind of job, or she, that whether we like it or not, we all have a tendency to do, whether we say it out loud or we look at people on the subway and we think those things, right? But for me, I was really interested in the lens through which they were looking at the images and the details that they were observing, and then sort of extrapolating or interpreting information, right? According to, whatever it is they thought about this woman. And maybe they didn't even reveal, you have to be very aware. Like, I've been there, I speak fairly good Swahili. I've been there for 1.5 years. I'm not from the community, right? So it's like when you hang out and you talk amongst yourselves, that's one thing. And then when you hang out, with sort of people and it's sort of more social, you may not be putting all your cards on the table. So I was also very aware of that. I don't know if that sort of addresses your point. I do see another question or point in the chat about whether or not I recorded the interviews, and believe it or not,
right.
I did record the interviews on a very old school tape recorder about this big with those tiny little cassettes. I don't even know if they work anymore, but I actually have the slide. I took images of all the images. I did not take any of the physical photographs with me. They were not mine to take. And I think there are a lot of ethical issues around who owns the photograph and who. I was very explicit about who I was, what I was a graduate student, what I wanted to do with these images. This was more of a scholarly endeavor. It was not some big commercial, an attempt at a commercial blockbuster. And I did leave all the photographs there. I actually really cataloged them and put them in plastic slips for Parekh and everything. Unfortunately, I found out after he passed several years later, this was the then owner of the studio, that he ended up selling them to an Italian. And so while I'm very close with the Parekh family, most of whom are in the UK, we have no idea where the actual kind of physical photographs are. But I do have recordings. I'm not sure that they're, fully viable. I have, sheets and sheets of interviews that have been transcribed. And that was really a huge thing. No one at the time had really done that before. We look at photographs by Malik Sidibe or Seydou Keita from Mali, and we talk a lot about, what we think is in the images and who we think is represented, but to hear that person speak in their own voice, thought for me as someone, as an African, as someone whose family is from there, was so incredibly important. And I argued sort of as a sort of probably overly strong-headed grad student that if we don't start to do this kind of work, we're just going to kind of be repeating the silencing of kind of the colonial subject. And we have plenty of, those kinds of images. So, and then the last point maybe to make is that all of this is a slice of a book that will be released by Damiani. So it'll be beautiful images, I think a total of maybe 70. And I've been working with Parekh's family quite a bit on this project. And then, a lot of text and the interviews, and that'll come out as a book in the spring of next year, which I'm super excited about.
Excellent. Congratulations.
Yeah.
Congratulations. We have a question about how expensive were those photo sessions? How frequently would women have their photos taken? Did they typically have numerous photo takens, and who was selecting? I mean, like you say, with Sidibe, right? He would post them outside, and you would see whole sheets of film with choices. Was there anything like that here?
Right. I mean, we're thinking in shillings, and at the time it was probably a few shillings, just to sort of put it in perspective, you're looking maybe at maybe $3, $4. That's a lot of money, right? Back then, for people that were probably, maybe making that, each week. So that's sort of where it's really, I talk a lot about how it's tied to status and class and this notion of what leisure even. But then there were the photographs that were seen as sort of a necessity, right? A marriage proposal where you needed to include a photograph, or documenting, a family gathering after Eid. Those were incredibly important. And then in terms of how often people went, sometimes people went once or twice, but I did, like in the case of Mrs. Uweso, encounter 5 and 6 images of hers kind of over the course of several years. So yeah.
And what was the sense of privacy? I mean, was Parekh able to, if somebody was interested in a picture of somebody that they found attractive, could they purchase that picture? Was that available?
No. Yeah. So the generally speaking, the images were kind of taken by Parekh of an individual. And then the individual would come back when they were developed to pick them up, and those were their images. And Parekh kept all of the negatives so that if you wanted to even come back and have your negative reprinted, but they really belonged to that person who either had commissioned or who was pictured in the work. And this is where it actually does get a little tricky, right? Because we do see Seydou Keita's images sort of circulating about, and those are images of people who went to him to have their portrait taken, but not necessarily to have their portrait sort of in circulation in this way. I mean, that's probably a whole other conversation or talk, right? Thinking about the currency of these images and how they enter into the commercial art market, and are, blown up and framed and editioned and now selling for a certain amount. And I'm very mindful of that, which is one of the reasons I've been in such close contact over the years with the Parekh family, and really made an effort from the very beginning to kind of speak with as many people as I could track down in the images.
Fun.
Yeah. Any other questions? If somebody wants to throw it in the chat or raise their hand and unmute themselves.
Would love to not hear my own voice. I never thought anyone would ever give me the opportunity to show off my very limited Hungarian, but I believe that it is Csikszentmihalyi.
Well, thank you. That's the psychologist who talks about this notion of flow and sort of happiness of flow. It looks like Mike Holland has a question. Hi, Mike.
Hi. So one of the when you were starting to speak, one of the comments that you made that, as the questions came through, sort of struck me, which was, in talking about some of the other, studio practices and how those images were talked about by Americans and Europeans. And you took a very extremely different path to sort of engage the sitters and the and the studio artist himself. Have you almost done like a sort of experimental art history, like take those images, kind of dump them into the groups of people who would have normally just spoken about without that connection, and sort of like compared that interpretation from the more academically trained community, but without that background knowledge that you have collected, and then sort of do a cross comparison of
that's so interesting that's a really great question. So there's another anthropologist, which is very different because I was trained in art history, from Germany, named Heike Baron, that's done quite a bit of work. And actually she was very helpful kind of in making some introductions in the region. She's done a lot of work in that region, but focuses on some similar images from a very, very anthropological, kind of more academic perspective. Some of which I agree with and some of which I don't agree with, because that's not, what many of the sitters kind of shared with me. But, it's interesting. I mean, obviously there's room for everybody. I came up, not to date myself, in grad school at a time at that sort of height of postmodernism, right? Where we were sort of all of a sudden thinking like, wow, maybe we should really think reflexively and kind of examine ourselves and like how we look at things and how, it was novel then to me. I'm like, really? I mean, it's like, it took us that long to all of a sudden look at like colonial photography and say like, gee, that doesn't say anything about the gentleman pictured. It says more about the eye of the colonial photographer, right? And how Europeans and Americans saw Africa and Africans. So I think as a young grad student, that's what I was kind of bumping up against, Mike, was I didn't want to repeat that. And I actually wasn't interested in what Americans and Europeans had to say. I was sort of like, well, what do Africans have to say? They have a lot to say, and we're not really discovering anything. Why don't we actually just go and sort of say, hey, like, talk to us about what you think about photography, and it started with my family interaction and kind of discussing, what I just showed you, for example, that image of wedding photographers. So, some of it, there was a little bit of a personal and political impetus. I had a lot of fairly traditional and conservative, professors at Columbia that I just sort of was like, you know what, I'm going to show this old guy like this. And then you realize like, wow, this kind of research is really hard. It's not as easy as we thought. But yeah, it's a very different approach. But at the same time, there are multiple histories now that have been written. I mean, there are many, many African scholars on the continent who also have been writing on these photographs. And then of course, contemporary photographers that are actively practicing and taking images and creating art, both here in the US, on the African continent, and even throughout Europe and the Caribbean. So it's exciting to see that body of work, just generally speaking, is growing, and there are different vantage points and different perspectives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks.
Question from Mari Carmen asking if there's any overlap between your research on Parekh and Prita Meyer's research on Swahili arts across the Indian Ocean.
Well, Prita I know quite well. She's at the Fine Arts Institute at Columbia, and really was trained more in architecture and architectural history, but also does, is interested more kind of in the material culture of the region. So I don't know that she has taken the same approach with the photographs, but her work on any kind of photography or material culture fits very, very nicely in sort of her larger body of scholarship, which is really terrific, on photography. On architecture, on space and culture within the same region.
And perhaps a last question, as I see we're over the 7 o'clock time, is from Rob Aft, asking if you've explored some of the photography around music and performance. He specifically mentions record albums and books on musicians like Shades of Benga.
Yeah, no, I haven't actually, but I did grow up with a lot of those albums. So, my dad has all the old covers the discs from Safari Sound and Miriam Makeba, and there's incredible Fela Kuti, incredible photographic imagery. Of course, somebody like Fela traveled with his own photographer, so everything he did and put out in the world really was documented. I have not done work on it, but I know it well from my childhood, and it makes you realize just how potent the visual is, right? And sort of crafting memories and framing up for you all different aspects of culture.
Absolutely.
I'm so delighted. Thank you all for having me and for spending your early Thursday evening. Thank you, Scott.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And if anyone doesn't mind, just quick turning on your camera, we'd love to get a final commemorative screenshot of this moment of us all here together. So if you don't feel comfortable, no pressure, but it'll be a great celebration.
Yay.
Right, hopefully that's good. All right.
Love it.
Well, as we said, this is our last speaker series for this season. Keep posted on our blog. We have some upcoming articles coming out, and otherwise we hope to see you all next year. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, everybody.
Thank
Be
you, Isolde.
well.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.